Thank you, Alex, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone who is here virtually today. It's great to be back at the showcase. I graduated in this spring and have been working on my postdoc, but it's really wonderful to be welcomed back to talk about the research that I completed as part of my PhD here at University of Minnesota, working with Dr. Nick Phelps and, of course, MACERC. I have a little bit of a cold today, so I apologize for any coughs or hoarseness that I have, but thank you again for being here and sticking with me. I'm going to talk about our work that was funded by MACERC to examine the motivations for illegal release of live bait fish. And before I really dive in here, I want to thank the collaborators and funders that have been a part of this. Obviously, MACERC and the Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources have been hugely instrumental, but this has been a massive collaborative effort across many departments of the university, folks at the DNR, and other volunteers that have been a part of this. So thank you again to everyone who made this possible. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the history and background of this issue. If you've been to one of my baitfish talks or if you're familiar with this will be old news to you, but if this is new to you, I hope that you learned something. Live baitfish are obviously incredibly important in Minnesota, both culturally, socially, and economically. They're very popular with anglers, and recreational angling is obviously a huge part of what makes our state great. The minnow industry has been around since as long as people have been fishing, and it has long been a part of our state's history. Baitfish in Minnesota are typically harvested from shallow productive lakes and streams, taken to a distributor or wholesaler, and eventually make their way to a bait shop where they're purchased by many of the over 1 million people that get a fishing license every year. We also have a decent amount of aquaculture happening in the state, but as of right now, the majority is coming from wild harvested sources. In 1974 in Minnesota, an import ban was enacted, meaning that bait from outside of the state could not legally be brought into the state. And this was done largely in part as a protective measure for the state's aquaculture and rising bait industries. However, almost immediately, there started to be controversy about this issue. There's an ongoing concern that the import ban and other factors create a shortage of live bait fish, and that has become a more and more sort of contentious issue over the last several years. Suppliers and anglers feel that they can't get the bait fish that they need. But there's also concern about what it could mean to actually reverse the import ban, what it means for in-state production. And there's been a lot of debate over it in the past several years, some of which you might have been following in the news or in the legislature. And the reason for some of this debate has to do with what baitfish can carry along with them. In addition to being highly popular bait, fish are really good carriers of microbes. And in fact, in live bait fish available for retail sale across the upper Midwest, we found a number of dangerous pathogens, including bacteria, viruses, and parasites. So live bait fish, as cute and wonderful as they are, can also be harboring dangerous fish pathogens. So there's some concern that they could be a potential vector for the spread of these pathogens and other invasive species into Minnesota lakes. So taking it all together, the risk pathway looks a little bit like this. We have millions of individual fish that are being moved from wild harvested sources that are subject to minimal disease testing and biosecurity, if any. We have little ability to trace these shipments across the landscape. They're sold to over 1 million anglers every single year, and these anglers are highly transient and dynamic, visiting several lakes across the landscape every year. And we have thousands of lakes and rivers and other bodies of water where the accidental or deliberate release of these baitfish into the water could be catastrophic if they're bringing along with them a pathogen or an invasive species. So taken together, this makes a lot of concern for this pathway to be a vector for the spread of invasive species and pathogens, and with good reason. We know from previous work that we've done in this lab and at MACERC that the angler behaviors that could facilitate the spread of live baitfish are fairly widespread. The graph on the right shows the simulated number of times that a fish was released on the landscape infected with, this is viral hemorrhagic septicemia virus as an example pathogen. And as you can see, that median number with the red dotted line is over 400,000. Now that represents a little bit of a worst case scenario, but the point is to say that the behaviors, what people actually are doing with their live bait fish, are widespread enough that the potential does exist for this pathway to spread infectious pathogens or invasive species. In particular, we found that live bait fish were used by about 70% of anglers in Minnesota. And 20% of those bait fish users release their live bait fish at least once a year. Live bait fish release is illegal in Minnesota, but despite this fact, we still found that about 1 in 5 people admitted to doing it at least once in the last year. And bait fish release was geographically widespread and more likely in younger anglers. So again, all of this taken together suggests that there's a potential for disease spread following the initial introduction of a pathogen into the bait fish supply. And this was true even when the pathogen prevalence was extremely low. Across all the scenarios we looked at, the proportion of anglers releasing bait was an important driver of risk, but it was especially true in scenarios where there were lots of anglers involved. For example, in scenarios where the outbreak was allowed to proceed statewide. Let's see. So it became really important to understand why anglers are releasing their live bait fish. Well, we asked them. On the first survey we did with anglers, we asked one open-ended question about how they chose to dispose of their bait in the way that they did. And there were a couple of themes that emerged. One theme was basically they wanted to do the right thing. They thought it was feeding other fish. They thought it was going to be a good thing because there were already minnows there naturally. Other people felt like it had been some sort of way that they had been taught, or that everyone they knew had always done it this way. And some people just basically said it's easier that way. But we wanted to know more. So we turned to social science to understand why anglers do what they do. And when we're trying to understand a behavior like bait fish release, that's difficult to observe, either because it's illegal, it's undesirable, people aren't doing it in a place that's easy to look. I guess you could get binoculars and stare out to the middle of the lake. We can do something using what's called the theory of planned behavior, which is a theory that suggests that we can understand the intent to do a behavior as a strong predictor of and highly correlated with the behavior itself. And the attitudes about the behavior, the subjective norms around the behavior, and the perceived control over the behavior in turn predict that intent. So if we want to understand why people are releasing their bait fish, we can measure the attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control that they have over that behavior to understand what's driving their choice to release their bait fish. So we did exactly that using a survey. We did a stratified random sample of the Minnesota DNR license database of 8,000 anglers. We used a mail pushed online survey design, which means people got a postcard in the mail and then were prompted to take a survey online. We asked them about their bait use, fishing habits, the species that they purchased, demographics, and many, many other questions. And we used complex post-survey weighting to correct for non-response bias. Then we used a technique called factor analysis and structural equation modeling to do the actual measurements of the psychological constructs that we're interested in. And I want to take a moment just to talk about what that looks like. Don't worry if this is not of interest to you. We'll come back around to the interesting stuff. But just for those that might be curious about how we measure this sort of thing, we measure psychological constructs in a little bit of an indirect way. Something like an attitude doesn't have an easy scale or yardstick that we can use, but we can infer its existence, its sort of latent, unmeasured existence, using a series of what's called indicator variables or indicator items. So we ask questions of the anglers, and based on the correlational structure that we observe in those indicator questions, we can infer the presence of a latent factor. And there's both reflexive indicators, which are considered sort of direct measures of the attitude construct. And there's also formative indicators, or belief statements that actually give rise to that attitude construct. I'm going to talk a little bit about those formative ones today, but in general, just know that when you're seeing this oval shape, it means we're measuring an actually latent factor using a series of indicator variables. So the results were, we got a little over 20% adjusted response rate. Similar to previous surveys, we found that 70% of anglers used live baitfish, and 30% said that live baitfish were extremely important to them. 28% said that they expected to release their live baitfish in the future. And there were significant differences in the intent to release across the region of residence, the age category that they fell into, and knowledge of the regulations, which is something I'll come back to in a moment. So again, we found that live baitfish use and release were widespread among Minnesotans. When figuring out which beliefs were most important for forming those attitudes about baitfish release, there's a couple things I want to highlight here. A negative value in this middle column means that a belief that the likelihood that releasing baitfish would introduce AIS was negatively correlated with attitudes towards the release. So in other words, the more likely that you thought that AIS were going to be introduced if you dumped bait into the lake, the less of a positive attitude you had towards bait release. And that was a really strong relationship. Harming the environment had the strongest relationship with a negative 0.71 correlation, meaning that the more likely people thought that release would harm the environment, the less likely that they were to intend to release their baitfish. On the other hand, people who thought it was going to do something good, like improving future fishing experiences or providing food for wild game fish, had more positive attitudes towards baitfish release. When we asked people about the subjective norms that they had surrounding live baitfish release, we found that people were more likely to have a belief that anglers that they were fishing with were an important determinant of their subjective norms than some of the other groups. So friends and family are also important at a 0.5, but anglers here listed at 0.53 is the most important norm referent group, meaning that folks who had a belief that they wanted to be like other anglers and that other anglers thought that they should release their bait were more likely to have a positive sort of evaluation of bait release. And finally, we also wanted to look at some of the beliefs that were underlying perceived behavioral control. So the more likely people were to believe that they wouldn't know the regulations, the more likely they were to feel that they would have a hard time choosing to release their bait. There also was a strong relationship with convenient place to dispose. So people feel that they don't always have the things that they need to dispose of their bait in the way that they want to. Looking at the model altogether, so just remember that each of these latent factors are represented by an oval, and they're measured by those indicators I mentioned before. We found that subjective norms was a very strong, important factor in driving intent to release live bait fish. You can think of these as sort of correlations or coefficients in a multiple regression model, with a larger number indicating a larger relationship or a stronger relationship between their subjective norms and their intent to release. Overall, we found that the model explained 66% of the variation in intent to release live bait fish, meaning that attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control are doing a pretty good job explaining the variation that we see in intent to release live bait fish. And again, subjective norms was the most important factor there. Interestingly, remember I said that knowledge of the regulations was an important determinant in intent to release. So we asked one question about this, framed as the text at the top, which says, releasing live bait fish into the water is the recommended method for disposing live bait fish. If they said true, they were wrong. That's not correct. If they said false, they were right. And there was also an option for don't know. As you can see from the dots here on the graph, these folks down here in the blue who were correct about the law were significantly less likely to indicate that they intended to release than people who didn't know the law. In fact, people who were wrong about the law were about as likely as people who didn't know to say that they were going to release. And that was true across age categories. So what this tells us is that knowledge of what the law actually asks or demands is a powerful motivator in changing behaviors. This is just looking at the relationship with attitudes and subjective norms and perceived control, again, for the group that responded that they don't know. So for folks that didn't know the rules, that didn't know the proper bait disposal recommendations, subjective norms was hugely important. So for those people that aren't referring to their knowledge of the law as a motivator for their behavior, they're really relying on the people that they're fishing with, their friends, their family, and those sort of cultural and social norms that they have to make their decisions about intending to release. So what does this mean? I think in general, this points to the evidence that education and awareness campaigns may be highly effective. A lot of times when it comes to invasive species prevention, there's this sort of knowledge behavior gap where people know the right thing, but they still don't do it. And we found that by and large, people that knew the right thing to do were pretty good at actually following through with it. Subjective norms are a highly influential factor in live bait fish release intention. And the norm referent that was most strongly correlated with that belief was other anglers I go fishing with. In other words, maybe we can build our campaigns around developing new social norms for positive AIS prevention behaviors, like 4 out of 5 Minnesota anglers release 0, or other anglers want you to dump your bait into the garbage, or something like that, that really capitalizes on that relationship and that strong desire that anglers have to be like other anglers and to do the right thing. They just have to be turned in the right direction. And that desire to protect the environment has to be channeled correctly. There were also obviously common misperceptions about bait release. The attitudes, positive attitudes towards bait release were driven largely by a belief that it was helping the lake, or that it was providing food for wild fish. So if we can correct those misperceptions, we can potentially make a big difference. And interestingly, perceived behavioral control was not a significant predictor in any subgroup. This was surprising to us because we thought that the presence or absence of convenient disposal sites or time at the launch or something like that would be a big driver, but it didn't seem to be the case. Overall, that knowledge of the regulations and the attitudes and subjective norms were much more important across groups. So with that, I would love to take any questions that you have. I apologize again for my voice. I hope that you were able to hear everything. And you can always contact me. I'll drop my email in the chat as well. So thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you, Meg, for your presentation. And a reminder to our audience that you can ask our presenter a question here using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. It works very similar to the chat. And we have about 25 minutes for questions, so we've got plenty of time to entertain your curiosities here. So far, we have got one question here. Is this information being shared with the DNR or other state or local agencies in such a way that there might be some brainstorming about ways to intervene at accesses, such as providing for good composting of bait disposal or something along those lines?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for your question. Actually, the DNR has been doing some really exciting pilot projects. I think Tina is on this call. So Tina, feel free to drop more context into the chat. But the DNR actually partnered with several local county and soil and water conservation districts to pilot some of these bait disposal techniques. And basically our work was very much in alignment with what they found, that raising awareness about the regulations, providing convenient places to dispose of live bait, and creating a sort of culture and social norm of proper disposal could really go a long way. So although those were just pilot programs, I think some of the results were fairly promising. And our results ultimately aligned a lot with the work that they're doing. So DNR is working on this. They have deployed some bait disposal stations, and our work is very much in alignment with what they're doing.
Great. Okay. While we wait for some more questions to come in, I will ask a question here as well while we're waiting. Meg, this might be my own ignorance here coming from this question, but what's a good way to think about what a subjective norm is if we're not sort of familiar with the social science wrapping that goes around that term?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's two kind of ways we think about it. One is what's called a descriptive norm. In other words, what do you think other people are doing? People want to be like other people typically. So a descriptive norm would be something like most other anglers, release their live bait fish, or most other people leave their wet laundry in the public laundromat, right? Or something like that. That's just like a descriptor of what you think other people are doing. The other part is called an injunctive norm, and that's related to that norm referent category that I was talking about. So it's not just what do you think other people think is correct, like, the DNR or your friends. It's not just what do you think your friends want you to do. It also has a piece of how much do you want to do what your friends want you to do? How much are you motivated to comply with their expectations? So that's wrapped up in that subjective norms. Not only are people interested in doing what their friends and family and other anglers are doing, they also believe that their friends and family and other anglers want them to release live bait, and that's driving the intent. So it's not just what you think that they want, it's also like your motivation to comply. And sometimes you see it where there's sort of, malicious or vandalistic non-compliance. I think that DNR wants me to do this, so I'm not going to do that, right? We didn't see a lot of that, but that is something possible that you would see. So it's sort of that two-pronged approach, one of them being that descriptive norm, and the other being the what's called injunctive norm.
Great, thank you for clarifying that for me, in addition to our audience. Tina, who you name dropped in a previous answer, Meg, has been writing in to let us know that she is signing off on everything you said in the first answer, and that she wanted to add additionally that collecting pledges to not release bait at bait shops is another new thing that they're going to be trying out. Tina, I did give you permission to speak in the call if you would like to add something to that yourself, though you don't need to if you don't want to. Okay. She said no, that's all right. Okay. We do have another question here. And the person says maybe they missed it, but is there any indication of how likely people are to change their behaviors? Like, are these behaviors are they baked in, or are they malleable? Is there any evidence in the data one way or the other there? Or are there any significant examples of places where we know the release of bait fish has proven to have an economic harm associated with it? So that's sort of a two-part question.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. I think in the first case, that's not something we directly measured. And that's something I have wondered about a lot, is whether or not there's certain sort of non-epistemic reasons for choosing the behavior that they do, that it's not based in belief, but there's some other factor that's sort of solidifying that behavior. For the most part, I do think that there's evidence, however, that people are willing to change that behavior. It's sort of evidenced by the fact that folks, once they learn the law, they seem to be interested in doing the right thing. We know that, the proportion of people who are more likely to release, like, they're tending to be younger, and in our experience, a little bit less experienced with fishing. So I think that maybe it's optimistic, but I'm optimistic in saying that people want to do the right thing, and they would if they knew what that was. So we didn't directly measure the sort of centrality of that behavior to their identity, or the sort of like cementedness of that. But I think there's some evidence to suggest that it could change. With respect to bait fish being released, being directly tied to economic losses, that's a tough one. And even in cases where we have a really good idea that bait fish release did result in a pathogen introduction, like where it's just a smoking gun, the sort of pathway of causality that we have to connect to get that all the way to, that resulted in an economic loss, like that's pretty difficult to do. A lot of times we don't have that smoking gun. We don't know what the pathway was that brought it there. But there are examples where round gobies, for example, coming into some of the inland lakes and parts of the Great Lakes, we know that they're in the bait trade. Sometimes goldfish or other fish like that. So we have examples from other sorts of taxa. I'm not aware of a really, really good example where we know that recreational angling brought in a disease and it resulted in economic losses. It's, not beyond the realm of possibility, but it's really difficult to beyond a shadow of a doubt prove that causal pathway.
Okay, so we've got another question here that I think it comes in a couple of parts, so I'll try to sort of chunk the parts here for you. The question is it only really live bait fish or minnows that are doing the damage, or could not alive ones also be contributing? And then there's some secondary questions here about like what happens if a live bait fish gets off the hook and gets introduced into a lake that way. And then minnow buckets were also asked about. How about flow through minnow buckets?
Yeah. So there's a lot of sort of assumptions built into this project, and then I'll just try to answer it in piecemeal, but if I miss something, please ask again. So first, with respect to dead and preserved bait, that is subject to regulation in terms of how it's preserved. And the ways that are legal to preserve dead bait are designed to kill pathogens, either through desiccation to the point where the pathogen is no longer viable, through treatment with salt or other preservatives. It would not be legal, for example, to take fish from out of state that are not treated with anything and then like use them dead. Like that would still be illegal. You do need to have the proper preservation techniques, and some species from certain areas like Lake Superior are not legal to use regardless. So there's other sort of checks in place. The reason that we focus on live bait fish is they're very popular, for one. The other is that there is already sort of a regulatory framework in place. It's not legal to release them, but we knew, or we had a sense that that wasn't being followed. So that's part of why the focus on that pathway is it was not well explored prior to this project. And finally, for a lot of these pathogens, a live fish is going to do a lot better job actually transmitting the bacteria or the virus. There's, of course, a non-zero risk of simply using the fish resulting in the release of a pathogen. Like, it comes out of their skin, or it bumps into another fish, or they get off the hook, something like that. Like, of course, that's always possible. But A, that's not illegal to have your fish accidentally fall off your hook. And B, that's going to be a lot less of a risk than physically the whole live fish moving into the lake and continuing to replicate that pathogen and have it spread in the water. So it's a risk thing, and it's also kind of a logistics and putting up boundaries around the project thing, just to say we're going to focus on this one particular illegal pathway, which is the illegal release. I feel like I missed something else.
Minnow buckets, I know we're talked about in there. I don't know if that's you give us something specific with that, but
yeah. So I guess I would wonder exactly what was meant by flow through. It's not illegal to, have your minnow bucket in the lake and have water refreshing. Like, that's good for the fish. It's that transferring of the water that's technically illegal right now. In terms of risk, again, I think, yes, there's some risk. It's not zero. But the question is always, what's the acceptable level of risk? And right now, what we've decided as a state is, it's acceptable to us, the marginal risk associated with simply leaving bait fish or having your bucket in the water. That's acceptable given the benefits that it provides. It's not acceptable, and the sort of risk benefit calculus is shifted for something like dumping those fish into the lake afterwards. So I'm not going to say it's zero risk, but it's definitely less than those live fish getting in the water.
Great. Keep the questions coming, folks. I think I have a related question then, Meg, that I was going to ask you either way, and I think this is the perfect opportunity for it. Are there some particularly troublesome or risky bait fish species that you would want to sort of highlight and make people aware of? Or is this a sort of a problem, a broad problem across the board? Like, if you could speak directly to someone who you knew was going to release bait fish and they had two different kinds, which would you rather have them not release? That kind of thing.
Yeah, honestly, it's going to come down to a numbers game. A lot of this is very, very low probability. Like the probability that any one trip or any one fish is infected and it gets released and it spreads is really, really low, right? It's on the order of tenths of percent. However, when you have over 1 million anglers taking 16 million, 20 million trips a year, it doesn't matter how low the probabilities are, it approaches a certainty that something's going to happen with those numbers going up. Obviously, like, fish that are coming straight from the wild, completely untested, are going to maybe have a little bit more risk, but I would never say to any particular angler that it's more or less risky than something else. It's just completely that numbers game. Even for those, I didn't talk a lot about it, but those simulations where we found hundreds of thousands of potential risky trips where a fish was released that was infected, that pathogen prevalence was less than 1% in most of those cases. So again, it's just a numbers game, and any one trip probably not going to have a big impact, but everybody's thinking, it's not going to have a big impact. And yeah, that happens several million times a year. So
Okay, great. I'll just remind everybody that we still have plenty of time for questions, although we are not obligated to keep Meg busy and ask her questions. I will ask one other question myself here while we're waiting for others to come in, because something really stuck with me from early on in your presentation that I just can't resist the desire to ask about. You were talking about those folks who might release bait fish because of this perception that it may actually have a positive environmental benefit, right? Like it's good for the lake or something that I would do this. Not just that it would be good for the fish, but that there's actually some positive benefit. Like they'll provide food for fish in the lake. And I can't help but make a parallel between that and sort of wishful recycling, right? This sort of misplaced or misguided altruism that sometimes comes in when we think about environmental issues. And is there something in particular you'd like to highlight about maybe that set of folks, or something in your data that speaks to what may be underneath that perception?
yeah, I mean, I think I do want to highlight the fact that, for the most part, we didn't know this going into it, but for the most part, like, anglers want to do the right thing. They want to do what they think others are doing. They want to follow the law. They want to help the lake. No one wants to see the lake get destroyed. Like, no one wants that. I think the question comes in whether, the risk and the benefit are worth it. Is there a possibility that the fish you release will become food for a northern pike that gets to grow a little bigger? Yes, of course. Like, that's always there. But the problem with invasive species dynamics is it's always the weakest link. It's always the least common denominator, right? So it only takes one, maybe a couple of introductions to spark a whole new infestation. So even if there's marginal benefit to you doing what you're doing, which there might not be, right? But let's say that there is, the risk is, at least for me, simply not worth it. So, I think again, act as if, your actions are the most important and the most like the strongest determinant of what's going to happen in that lake, like, because it could be that you were the unlucky one that dumped something bad in. So I think, again, like, I want to highlight and thank people who are really interested in doing the right thing, but point out that it's a numbers game, and you know it's often a weakest link that lets in a pathogen or an invasive species.
Wow. So yeah, we just shook loose a whole bunch of questions, a whole bunch of questions there, which is great. So I'm gonna try to pick and choose here, based on what just came in, and I think this question seems like it's directly related. Do you think it's that most of them want to do the right thing, or just the easiest thing, to the extent that those things overlap? Right? Are they just like all of us? Don't we all want to do the easiest thing? And do you have a
Yeah.
sort of comment about that?
Yeah, I think, of course, we all want to take the easy way, but we did find that even among people who felt like it was somewhat difficult to find a place to dispose, they still did the right thing and disposed properly. So it's not that they completely felt like it was so easy and it was just no barriers to them at all. They did perceive some difficulty with that, but they still, by and large, were interested in following the law. I think that one, is important to remember the sort of public health adage, which is, make the healthy thing easy, cheap, mindless, like remove all those barriers, just make it completely unthinkable. And all of a sudden you have this new habit of doing the right thing. So I think that's very applicable here and related to what a lot of the DNR work has been, which is removing those barriers from folks. So yes, absolutely. It's a convenience thing. We, again, by and large, though, found that people who knew the law did the right thing and were able to overcome those difficulties that they had.
Okay, great. So we've got a couple of questions here that I'm going to combine together, so into a two-parter. Someone wanted you to sort of clarify on, okay, if I have this bait bucket and I put that in the water and then maybe I carry that to another lake, and then put that bucket into a new body of water, is that a potential source of introduction? And then a related question to me, it seems like, is okay, some people may understand what the law is, but they may have, like, in the winter, they may think, okay, if I leave these fish here on the lake ice, they're gonna die by the time spring comes along. So maybe there's this perception among some anglers that, okay, I'm
Hmm.
not supposed to put my live bait in the water, but it's gonna
Hmm.
die anyway, or something like that, and that might be part of that disconnect.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about like relative risk. The least risky thing you can do is not use it ever. Right. But like that's not always an option for folks. And it is like live bait is really important to a lot of Minnesotans. And I'm not gonna demonize it at all. But like there's a non-zero risk, right? Most risky would be just dumping everything in, right? But and there's a gradient in between that. So I think recognizing that, of course, there's a small, probably very, very, very minor risk of simply leaving bait on the ice, for example. Some pathogens are going to be hardy through that winter. They're going to last outside of the body of an animal, but a lot of them, especially viruses, don't like to be outside of their host for very long, right? So like they're going to die off. So I would never say that there's absolutely no risk and it's totally fine, do whatever you want. But at the same time, we're really focused on reducing those high risk behaviors that already have a sort of legal regulation around them. With respect to the bait buckets, yeah, absolutely. I think people do bring home buckets of water, bring it to another lake, something like that. That's not legal, not encouraged. We didn't look at this at all because we were really focused on the fish themselves, but I think there's some promise in providing like well water or tap water at the launch so people can swap their water out. But again, all of this, like, it's really marginal risk, but it only takes once or twice to get a new infestation going if the conditions are right. So whatever you can do to reduce that risk at multiple stages, cleaning your equipment, swapping out your water, not releasing your fish, all of those are going to reduce that risk, hopefully below a level where anything could actually happen.
Okay, we've got another question here. Any ideas or any more ideas on how we might be able to sort of influence these subjective norms, shake them loose, maybe leverage peer pressure in a productive way to get folks to properly dispose of their bait?
Yeah, I think relying a lot on folks who are sort of community, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of pillars in the community. This can be the bait shop, this can be guides, this can be, oh, my lights just went off. That's funny. These can be people who have a particularly strong leadership role, like just creating that culture of doing that thing. And again, I think making that path really smooth for folks can go a long way. Um, a lot of younger anglers we found and people who had not been exposed to much fishing were the ones that tended not to know the regulations and tended to release. So focusing on those, new people coming into this sport, I think could be helpful. I haven't examined it yet, but there is, some evidence to suggest that younger people are using things like social media more to get their information. So that might be appropriate. Um, I think everything that DNR is doing now, though, is aligning pretty well with what we're finding it could be effective. So that's good.